For decades, one currency has quietly run the entire global economy, and almost nobody stopped to ask why. The US dollar isn't just America's money. It's the oil the world's engine runs on. Every barrel of crude, every international loan, every central bank reserve on earth is priced through it. And that's not an accident. It's a privilege. Economists have a name for it, coined by a French finance minister back in the 1960s who was more than a little annoyed about it, the exorbitant privilege. And for the last few years, a rumor has been spreading through financial media, whispered in headlines and shouted on Twitter, that this privilege is dying. That the dollar's reign is ending. That BRICS nations are building an alternative. That de-dollarization is here. So today we're going to find out if any of that is actually true, or if it's just the financial equivalent of a doomsday prepper selling you canned beans. But to understand whether the dollar's throne is actually wobbling, you first have to understand how it got there in the first place. Because the dollar didn't become the world's reserve currency by being the best currency. It became the world's reserve currency because of a deal made in 1944, in a hotel in New Hampshire, by 44 countries trying to rebuild a planet that had just spent 5 years bombing itself into rubble. That agreement, called Bretton Woods, pegged every major currency to the dollar, and pegged the dollar to gold. It was the birth of the modern financial system, and the dollar was handed the keys. Then, in 1971, Nixon killed the gold peg entirely. And by all logic, that should have been the end of the dollar's dominance. No gold backing it. No promise behind it, except trust. But instead, something stranger happened. The US made a new deal, this time with Saudi Arabia, that oil would be priced and sold exclusively in dollars. And in exchange, America would provide military protection to the Saudi kingdom. That arrangement became known as the petrodollar system. And it meant that literally every country on earth that needed oil, which is every country on earth, needed dollars first. So even after gold was gone, the dollar's grip only got tighter. And that's how you end up with a currency that isn't backed by gold, isn't backed by oil directly, but is backed by something arguably more powerful: global habit, global infrastructure, and global trust. So what does that privilege actually get America? Well, imagine you're the only country on earth that can print the currency everyone else needs to buy the things they need. That's an insane position to be in. It means the US government can borrow money more cheaply than any other country. Because global demand for dollar assets like treasuries never really dries up. It means American companies can borrow in their own currency for international trade, while companies in almost every other country have to deal with currency risk. It means the US can run trade deficits for decades without the kind of currency collapse that would cripple literally any other nation trying the same thing. Basically, being the reserve currency means you get to buy real stuff, cars, oil, factories, with money that costs you almost nothing to produce. It's the financial version of controlling the printer that prints the only paper the whole world accepts. But here's the thing about privileges like this: they only exist as long as everyone keeps agreeing to play along. And recently, some very big players have started to look like they're getting tired of the game. Enter BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now a growing list of new members including Iran, Egypt, and the UAE. For the past few years, headlines have loved to frame BRICS as a coalition assembling to dethrone the dollar. There's been talk of a BRICS currency, gold-backed baskets, bilateral trade deals in local currencies instead of dollars, and on the surface, it sounds like the beginning of the end. So let's actually look at what's happening versus what's being said. Because those are two very different things. Here, quote, what is real? China and Russia have dramatically increased trade settled in yuan and rubles instead of dollars. Especially
Central
after
banks
Russia
around
got
the
cut
world,
off from the SWIFT
especially in
payment
emerging
system in
markets,
2022,
have been buying gold at the fastest pace in decades, partly as a hedge against exactly this kind of dollar dependency risk. And several countries, India and the UAE among them, have signed bilateral agreements to trade oil in currencies other than the dollar. These aren't rumors. These are documented real shifts happening in real time. But here's what's not real, or at least not close to real yet.
There is no BRICS currency. It's been floated as an idea, discussed at summits, and then quietly shelved every single time, because getting 5 to 10 countries, with wildly different economies, wildly different inflation rates, and in some cases, open hostility toward each other to agree on a shared currency, is not a policy proposal. It's a fantasy. The Eurozone took decades of painful integration to pull off a shared currency between friendly, geographically connected democracies, and even that nearly fell apart during the Greek debt crisis. Now imagine trying that, with China and India, two countries that had a literal border skirmish a few years ago. It's not happening anytime soon. And anyone telling you it is happening next year is selling you something. Usually gold, usually crypto, usually a newsletter subscription. So if the currency alternative isn't real, what's actually driving the dollar is dying narrative? Well, it comes down to one number that people love to wave around without context. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves. Back in 1999, the dollar made up about 71% of global reserves. Today, that number sits closer to 58%. And
This
at
marked
first
a
glance,
new era
that
of
looks like
economic
exactly the
cooperation.
kind of decline the headlines are screaming about. A steady multi-decade slide. Death by 1,000 cuts. But here's the part that never makes it into the panic tweets. Where did that share actually go? Did it go to the euro? No. The euro's share has barely moved. Did it go to the yuan? The currency BRICS supposedly wants to crown as the new king? No. The yuan still sits at under 3% of global reserves, a number that's actually barely grown in the last 5 years, despite China being the world's second largest economy. So where did the dollar's lost share actually go? It went to a basket of smaller currencies, the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar, the Swedish krona. Currencies nobody is building a geopolitical rebellion around. Central banks aren't fleeing the dollar for a rival. They're diversifying at the margins, the exact same behavior any rational portfolio manager does after decades of concentration risk. That's not a coup. That's just prudent risk management dressed up as a headline. And here's economist and Nobel laureate Paul Krugman, who spent years pushing back on this exact narrative, explaining why the de-dollarization story keeps getting overstated. The dollar remains the dominant reserve currency because there really isn't a viable alternative. It's not that people love the dollar, it's that the alternatives all have serious problems of their own. And that's really the crux of the entire argument. Because for a currency to replace the dollar as the reserve currency, it doesn't just need people to dislike the dollar. It needs to actually be better, deep, liquid capital markets,
We must consider
rule of
all
law,
the economic
free
indicators.
capital flows, and enough trust that a central bank in, say, Indonesia is willing to hold billions of it as a safety net. And when you actually run that test against the euro, the yuan, or gold, none of them pass. The euro has deep capital markets but no unified fiscal policy backing it, which is exactly why it nearly collapsed during the Greek crisis. The yuan has neither free capital flows nor rule of law that foreign governments trust, because China actively controls how money moves in and out of the country, which is disqualifying for a reserve currency by definition. And gold, while a real hedge, isn't a currency you can use to settle $1 trillion trade deal on a Tuesday afternoon. It's a store of value, not a medium of exchange for a global economy running at internet speed. So, if the alternatives don't actually work, why does the dollar is collapsing narrative keep going viral every single year? Because just like every other financial narrative I've covered on this channel, don't actually work, why does the dollar is collapsing narrative keep going viral every single year? Because just like every other financial narrative I've covered on this channel, because remember, the entire exorbitant privilege depends on one thing above all else. The world believing the US will always honor its debt and always play by predictable rules. And every time the debt ceiling turns into a political hostage negotiation, every time sanctions get used as a financial weapon against a growing list of countries, every time the deficit balloons past $1 trillion with no plan in sight, that trust doesn't shatter overnight, but it does erode, slowly, quietly, the same way trust always erodes, one small crack at a time, until one day you look up and there's a lot more cracks than you remembered. And that's actually the pattern that matters. Reserve currencies in history don't die from a single event. The British pound didn't lose its reserve status the day World War II ended. It lost it over roughly 3 decades, as Britain's economic dominance faded, and its ability to project trust and stability slowly eroded alongside it. The dollar's role is evolving gradually amid a multipolar shift in reserve diversification. Doesn't get clicks. The dollar is about to collapse and your savings are at risks, gets clicks. And there's an entire ecosystem, gold dealers, crypto influencers, doomsday newsletter writers, whose business model depends on you being scared enough of dollar collapse to buy whatever they're selling as the alternative. Fear isn't just a byproduct of this narrative. For a lot of people repeating it. Now, that doesn't mean there's zero risk here. It would be dishonest to say nothing is changing, because something is changing, just not the something people are yelling about. The real risk to the dollar isn't a rival currency stealing the crown. It's America's own fiscal behavior slowly eroding the trust the system was built on. But the slow version, a gradual multi-decade diversification away from total dollar dependence, driven by America's own fiscal choices rather than any rival strength. That part is real, and it's been happening quietly for years. It's just not dramatic enough to trend. And that's exactly why traditional financial media either ignores this story or oversimplifies it into a panic headline, because the dollar's dominance is slowly eroding due to structural fiscal issues over multiple decades isn't a headline. It's a thesis paper. But dollar collapse incoming is a headline. Even if it's wrong, the real story isn't as loud as the fake one, but it matters a lot more. Because if you're positioning your money based on a currency collapse that isn't coming next year, you're going to miss the actual slow-moving shift that is coming. The one measured in decades, not headlines. Nobody woke up one morning and switched from pounds to dollars. It was a slow bleed measured in decades, not headlines. And if the dollar ever does lose its throne, it almost certainly won't be because BRICS launched a shiny new currency at a summit. It'll be because decades of fiscal mismanagement and weaponized financial policy slowly convinced the rest of the world there was finally a reason to look elsewhere. Whenever elsewhere actually becomes viable. So let's go back to the question from the start of this video. Is de-dollarization actually happening? Or is it fear mongering? And the honest answer, the one that doesn't fit neatly into a scary thumbnail, is that it's both, just not in the way you've been told, the panic version. A BRICS currency dethroning the dollar next year is fiction. It's not close to happening, and the actual data on trade and reserves proves it. So if you want to actually understand what's happening to the financial system underneath the noise, hit subscribe, because I'll keep covering the stuff that's true but boring, instead of the stuff that's false but loud. Because the real risks to the dollar aren't the ones screaming at you from a thumbnail. They're the ones quietly building in the background while everyone's distracted by the ones that are.